They say the wind carries memories in these parts, soft moans that drift across the plains, stirring dust and sorrow like. On the edge of a dying stretch of land, just outside a town too small for maps, a widow stood in the ashes of everything she'd once called home. Her name was Clara Miles. Folks knew her as the woman who'd never left, the one who stayed after her husband died of fever and her son vanished chasing war. Some said she was stubborn. Others said she was just too poor to leave. But the truth was simpler than gossip. Clara had loved that land. The cracked boards of the porch, the splintered rocking chair that creaked like an old friend, the rough soil her husband once called God's forgotten acre. She had loved it all, fiercely, foolishly, with the kind of love that doesn't ask for anything in return. Now, it was blackened earth and smoke. The barn was gone. The chicken coop had collapsed like a fallen prayer. Her last cow, May, the one that still gave milk in winter, was nowhere in sight. The house, if you could still call it that, was a skeletal frame of charred beams and a chimney standing crooked like a broken tooth. She stood barefoot in the soot, her skirts heavy with ash and the hem torn by thorns. In her hand, she held a half-melted horseshoe, the last piece of her husband's forge. It had been his pride, that little forge. He'd used it to shoe wild horses and mend neighbor tools, even in the worst drought years. Now it was just warped eye and a memory. The sheriff hadn't come. No one would. She knew better than to wait. Folks in Merrill Creek were kind in words and cruel in action. They'd nod at her in church, pass her a pie now and then, but when she knocked on doors the morning after, soot still in her hair and smoke in her voice, every eye turned glassy. "Lord help you," they said. "We got our own to worry about, Miss Clara." 3 men had done it. She'd seen their eyes, one pale as quartz, another with a scar from ear to chin, and the last no older than her boy had been when he left. They'd laugh while they burned it, said it was just making room for better stock. One had torn the cross from her wall and pissed on it. That night, as she sat under the blackened stars, the silence screamed louder than any fire. She buried her hands in the cold dirt where her garden used to grow. The carrots would never sprout again, nor the beans that clung to the trellis like little green fists. Everything she'd sown had been taken, everything she'd mended with tired fingers and soft hymns. Even the graves of her husband and baby girl were blackened to the edges, the stone crosses tipped by boot heels. It wasn't just cruelty. It was message. But sometimes, the wind carries more than memory. 3 days later, word began to pass through the saloons and stables. Not loud, not shouted. Whispers, like someone trying not to speak a curse too loudly. A moon was coming. Or had come. Or maybe had been seen near the northern ridgeline, saddlebags heavy, hat low, coat darker than a preacher's warning. They called him the ghost of Elkhorn Pass. Others just said him. No name. No town claimed him. Some thought he was dead. Others swore he died twice. They said he once killed a mun from 2 ridges away. Said he could shoot a hawk from the sky blindfolded. Said he didn't sleep, didn't eat, didn't speak unless blood was about to spill. Old-timers remembered a lawman by a different name, long ago, before something happened and he walked away from a badge. Clara heard the name whispered by 2 boys behind the general store. She was sweeping floors for pennies, taking whatever scraps the owner's wife would let her gather. One of the boys, no older than 15, said, "He ain't real. Just stories." The other whispered, "He's real enough if the outlaws believe he's coming." Clara didn't believe in saviors. Not anymore. Not in lawmen or church bells or fireside prayers. But that night, while the wind scratched the corners of her soul and her belly cried from hunger, she lit a candle stub and placed it on the edge of the ruin that was once her hearth. Just in case the stories were true. In the distance, coyotes howled. In the canyon west of town, where the cottonwoods grew like ghosts and the rocks bled red in moonlight, 3 men camped with stolen whiskey and laughter thick as sin. The one with the scar carved meat from a deer they hadn't earned. The youngest one had Clara's shawl tied around his neck, her silver hairpin glinting in the firelight. They passed a bottle, spoke of women like cattle, and joked about fire. They didn't notice the silence that crept up on them. They didn't see the horse on the ridge, or the men upon it, still as stone, watching. Clara slept on dirt, wrapped in the blanket a kind laundress gave her 2 winters back. It smelled of soap and iron and comfort, though it had grown thin as onion skin. She dreamed of her son, of the way he used to whistle while fixing fence posts, of the scar he got above his brow the day he fell from a hayloft and how he cried not from pain but shame. She dreamt of her husband's hand on hers, strong and calloused, the way it anchored her when storms rolled through. And then she dreamed of fire again. Screaming. Smoke. The smell of hatred. She woke up crying. Morning came with no answers. Just a sky too bright for sorrow and a sun that mocked her with its warmth. She rose, dusted herself off, and walked to the creek to wash. Her reflection stared back with hollow cheeks and eyes too old for 40 years. She cupped the water and drank, cold as guilt. When she returned to what was left of her land, there was something new. On the edge of her fence line, where the ground was still blackened and the grass dared not grow, a small circle of stones had been placed. In the center, an unopened tin of beans. Next to it, a folded blanket, clean, thick, dark brown. And beside it, something she hadn't seen in years, a single bullet, balanced upright in the dust. Clara stared at the offering, her throat tightening. She turned quickly, scanning the hills, but there was nothing. No sound. No trail. Just wind, carrying a whisper she couldn't quite understand. She picked up the bullet and felt the weight of it. Not just metal. A promise. The road into Merrill Creek was more dust than trail, and Clara walked it with blistered feet and a ribbon of dried blood on her heel. Her hands were wrapped in the remnants of a flour sack, fingers raw from clawing through ash. She passed the old cottonwood where her son once carved his name, but the bark had been stripped by time and weather, and all that remained was the ghost of a letter J. By the time she reached the edge of town, her shadow was long and wavering. A dog barked once and then backed away, tail tucked. The streets weren't empty, but they felt that way. Doors didn't slam, they whispered shut. Windows blinked once before curtains sealed their glass eyes. She walked past the smithy, where the clang of iron paused just long enough to let silence mock her. The general store's porch sagged like its owner, but the bell above the door still gave a cheerful chime, as if unaware of the weight that crossed its threshold. Clara stood inside, eyes scanning the shelves not for flour or sugar, but for mercy. She picked up a tin of beans, same brand as the one left on her land, and approached the counter. Miriam Potts stared at her with tight lips and the kind of pity that burns worse than contempt. "You paying for that, Clara?" Clara held the tin like it was the last piece of her home. "I'll work. Sweep floors. Scrub your windows. You leave that on the counter and let others who can pay. Miriam's voice sliced through the warm light like frost. "We all got losses. Can't carry yours too." Clara nodded slowly, placing the tin down with trembling hands. She turned without another word, back out into the sun, where whispers crawled like snakes through the dust. "She's cursed. That fire was a warning. Should have left years ago. Fool woman." She kept walking, past a blacksmith who wouldn't meet her eye, past the church where her husband was buried in a suit borrowed from another man's wedding. She walked until the saloon's swinging doors creaked into view, breathing out warm air laced with whiskey, sweat, and sin. It wasn't a place for widows. But she wasn't just a widow anymore. She stepped through and the laughter died faster than a sinner's prayer. Heads turned. Boots froze. A piano note stumbled and fell silent. The bartender, Saul Greeley, leaned forward with a grin that showed every tooth he hadn't lost to brawling. "Well, if it ain't the blackbird of bad luck," he drawled. "Come to haunt our drinking hole." "I came to speak to Boone," Clara said, voice low but steady. Laughter cracked across the room. "You think Boone's gonna help you? He's out hunting game that don't talk back." Saul's grin widened. "Unless you got something to offer." Clara didn't flinch. She reached into her apron and pulled out the bullet, the one left on her land, still gleaming faintly in the low-light. She set it on the bar. "Whoever left that knows who burned my home." A beat of silence. Then a snort. "Hell, lady, that's just a warning from them outlaws. Telling you next time, they'll finish the job. Take your fancy bullet and get out." She turned to leave, holding back tears, but the room shifted before her foot touched the floor. Someone was standing in the doorway. He wasn't tall, but he filled the frame like a storm fills a canyon. Dust clung to his coat, long and sun-faded, edges tattered by time. His hat sat low, shadowing a face carved from road and regret, lined, leathered, with a jaw that looked like it had said too much and now refused to say more. One cheek carried an old scar, faded but sharp, and his eyes. They were the kind of eyes you didn't meet twice. Heavy as law, quiet as death. Eyes that saw past your words, your smile, your sins. He walked in without speaking. Spurs silent. The saloon seemed to hold its breath. The stranger's gaze swept the room like a slow wave, stopping only on Saul, who suddenly found the countertop fascinating. Then he turned to Clara, and for a moment, the whole world narrowed to the space between them. He didn't speak. He didn't nod. But something passed between them, an understanding born of ash and silence. Clara stared up at him, unsure if she was looking at salvation or a deeper ruin. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words died on her tongue. The stranger turned back to the bar, picked up the bullet she'd left, and rolled it between his fingers like it was made of glass. Then, in one motion, he flicked it toward Saul, where it landed with a metallic thud. "Your floor's dirty," he said, voice low and dry as sagebrush. "You should clean it." Saul blinked. What the hell does that? But the stranger was already walking out. Clara followed. Outside, the sun had begun to bleed orange into the sky. The town watched from windows, behind wagons, from shadows. Children stood silent behind their mother's skirts. She caught up to him near the well. His horse, a lean, muscle-worn beast with eyes almost human, waited tied to the post. "You left it, didn't you?" she asked. He turned his head slightly. "What if I did?" "Then you know who they are." "I know many things." "Then help me," she whispered. "Please." He studied her, eyes sharp but unreadable. "Why?" "They stole everything," she said, voice cracking. "And no one will stand for me. I can't fight with a plow or a prayer. But I have eyes. I can watch. I have hands. I can help. Just don't leave me alone in this." He was quiet for a long time. Then, almost reluctantly, he said, "They call me Fallon." Clara nodded. "They call me Cursed." His mouth twitched, almost a smile, but too tired for the full distance. "Cursed people make the best witnesses," he said. "They've seen what others won't." And then he mounted his horse, eyes scanning the hills like he was reading the wind. Clara stood in the street as dust curled around her boots. She didn't know if she'd just made a pact with salvation or death. But for the first time since the fire, she didn't feel invisible. Somewhere behind her, a door creaked open and then closed again. And far off, in the belly of the land, thunder murmured, though the sky held no clouds. The canyon lay like an open wound across the earth, red rock cut deep by wind and time, sheltering the sort of men who thrived in places no law dared ride. Beneath its jagged rim, a crooked campfire flickered like a lie told too many times. Around it sprawled the remains of what they'd taken, bags of flour and bolts of cloth, rifles with notched stocks, jewelry torn from necks that had once trusted safety, and bottles, so many bottles, that even the stars above seemed to sway with their reckless clinking. 5 men circled the fire. One polished his boots with stolen whiskey. Another sharpened a knife against the bones of a split-rail fence they'd burned down just for sport. A third strummed a banjo missing 2 strings, humming a hymn that had once been holy before he drowned it in malice. Their laughter was raw and joyless, like wolves barking over spoiled meat. But the one they called Brig had no need to laugh. He sat slightly apart, back straight, hands folded. His coat was fine, black with silver stitching, but blood-stained the cuffs, and his boots were too clean for a man who claimed the dirt. His face was lean, hawkish, with a jaw sharp enough to split bone and eyes the color of gunmetal. He didn't drink. Didn't need to. Power made its own kind of intoxication, and Brig was drunk on the fear he cultivated. "You hear the story?" one of the boys asked, voice slurred. "Some say she's still walking." "Widow. Clara." Brig's eyes flicked to him. The boy fell silent. "I lit that fire myself," Brig said quietly, the words slow and razor-edged. "Watched her run barefoot through smoke. She's either dead or too broken to matter." "But," another piped up nervously, "what about the men? The one riding the ridge? They're whispering ease." "Whispers don't bleed," Brig snapped. "Men do." He stood and the fire seemed to dim with him. No one spoke. Even the canyon wind fell still. He walked to the edge of camp, eyes scanning the rim above, slow and deliberate. Somewhere beyond that black horizon, someone was listening. Fallon lay still as stone beneath the cover of a stunted pine, rifle across his chest, breath slow and measured. He'd watched the camp for 3 nights. Watched how Brig never let his back face the fire, how the others were too drunk to notice. He memorized the order of their watches, how one always fell asleep, how another slipped away with a flask too heavy for quiet. He hadn't moved on them yet. Not because he couldn't, because the right time always came for those who waited. And while he waited, the town suffered. In Merrill Creek, fear walked in boots. The outlaws didn't hide. They rode through town at dusk, 4 wide, grinning like dogs with meat between their teeth. They drank from bottles while riding past the church, mocked the preacher, slapped hats from old men's heads. No one stopped them. The sheriff had vanished 2 weeks back, and no one had asked where. Most figured Brig had buried him somewhere the desert couldn't even mourn. Clara watched it all from the edge of the well, apron folded over her arms like armor. She saw a girl dragged by her braid down the boardwalk before her father paid 3 coins to stop the laughter. She saw the saloon's window shatter when Saul refused another free bottle. And she saw the way every door closed a little faster now, even before the hoofbeats grew loud. They were testing the edges, seeing how far rot could spread before something pushed back. Each night, Clara walked to the edge of her ruined homestead. She would kneel in the cold dust and speak words no longer meant for God, but for the wind and the stars and anyone still listening. She didn't ask for revenge. She asked only for strength, to not be small, to not be afraid when the moment came. And somewhere beyond her, Fallon moved like a ghost with purpose. He left no prints, only impressions, a broken twig near the canyon's edge, a trail of cigarette ash under the blackjack tree where the youngest outlaw pissed each night, a bullet casing placed neatly beside the tracks leading out of town, like a warning from a myth made flesh. He watched them scatter their stolen coins over a poker table. Watched them cheat each other. Watched Brig order one of his own to kneel just to prove he could. Every moment became a part of Fallon's plan. Every careless act, every blink of arrogance, every misplaced bottle and hour of drunken sleep carved a path to their ruin. He found their horses tethered too close to a sharp bend in the canyon wall. Bad position, easy spook. He found the saddlebag where Brig kept his ledger, a list of names and places marked in code only bastards understood. He found, most importantly, that Brig believed himself untouchable. And that was always the fatal mistake. Fallon returned to town just once, in the hush before dawn. Clara found him leaning against the post behind the church, hat low, hands wrapped around a cup of stale coffee. "I thought you were gone," she said, her voice thin with sleep and wind. "I was," he said. "Now I'm not." "Have you seen them?" He nodded once. "All of them." "Then when?" "When the storm's ready." Clara stepped closer. "Do you believe in God, Mr. Fallon?" He looked at her, slow and steady. "I believe in balance." She nodded. "That's more than most." He turned his head to the horizon, where the stars began to pale. "You got 3 days. When I move, it'll be loud. You stay here. Lock your doors. Let no one in." Clara wanted to argue, but something in his voice made silence feel holier than defiance. He tipped his hat and vanished into morning mist. In the canyon, Brig sat staring at a fire that no longer warmed him. He felt the air shift. The laughter of his men rang hollow, echoes bouncing back like warnings. His hand hovered near his revolver more often now. He slept with one eye open and didn't know why. But Fallon knew. The wind had begun to turn. The ground itself seemed to hold its breath. And in the dark places between law and chaos, the gathering storm took form, one silent step at a time. The desert was a sheet of scorched gold under the afternoon sun, flat and shimmering like it might melt underfoot. Heat waves rose in slow tremors from the cracked earth, and the wind carried dust that whispered through brittle grass and dead mesquite. Out there, where sky met sand with nothing in between, Clara rode with her hands clenched tight around the reins of a borrowed mule, her eyes fixed ahead on the dark line of riders gathering near the dry gulch. She hadn't meant to leave town that morning. She hadn't meant to follow the tracks leading west. But when she heard that Brig and his men had returned to the edge of her ruined land, drunk, laughing, daring any soul to come near, something in her snapped. Grief had cooled into something heavier. Not fire, but stone. Not rage, but resolve. She packed water, strapped a small knife to her thigh, and left before the town's silence could stop her. The outlaws stood around the wreckage of her barn like wolves circling an old bone, drinking from canteens filled with stolen whiskey, tossing tin cups into the dust. Brig sat atop a black stallion, eyes hidden behind mirrored spectacles that reflected the hollow remains of what they'd burned. He saw her coming and grinned. "Well now," he said, loud enough for his boys to hear. "If it ain't the Ash Bride herself. What brings you crawling back, Clara? You come to beg, or did the ghost call you home?" She stopped 20 paces from them, mule breathing hard beneath her. "I came to tell you something," she said. Laughter erupted. Brig tilted his head. "Do tell." She slipped a knife from under her skirt and drove it into the earth beside her. Then she stood tall. I buried my husband with my own hands. Watched my boy ride off to war. Survived droughts, famine, and your fire. And I'm still standing. You think that makes me weak?" Her voice was calm, clear. "It makes me the last thing you'll ever see." Silence, then a scoff from one of the outlaws, a red-haired brute with a patchy beard who stepped forward with his hand on his belt. That's when the first shot came. Sharp, clean, distant. The red-haired man dropped like a sack of grain, a hole between his eyes blooming red. His hat tumbled off in the breeze and landed at Clara's feet. Panic spread through the gang like wildfire. Briggs spun in his saddle, scanning the ridge. Where? A second shot cracked the air. The man with the banjo, a cruel-faced weasel who once spat in Clara's face, fell clutching his chest, gurgling on blood. Screams erupted. "Fallon!" someone shouted. "He's here!" They scrambled for cover, ducking behind rocks and broken fence posts. Briggs barked orders, but no one listened. Fear had dissolved the chain of command. Another man broke for the canyon edge, galloping hard. A third shot split the silence. His horse kept running, but he fell like dead weight, bouncing once in the dust before lying still. Clara stood frozen in the center of it all, heart pounding so loud she could barely hear the wind. A figure moved on the ridge now, slow, deliberate, descending like a shadow unrolling across the land. Fallon walked with the weight of history in his boots. Coat flapping in the wind, rifle across his back, revolver drawn, his face unreadable. The sun cast him in bronze and bone. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Briggs dismounted, drawing both pistols, crouched low behind a rock. Two of his men still stood with him, barely boys, both shaking. "Shoot him!" Briggs screamed. "He's just one man." They raised their rifles. Fallon didn't raise his voice. He just raised his gun. The first boy hesitated, and was rewarded with a bullet through the thigh. He screamed, dropped his rifle, crawled back behind a barrel. The second boy dropped his weapon before he was even aimed. "I didn't sign up for this," he sobbed. "I didn't sign up to die." Fallon passed him like smoke, eyes only for Briggs. Clara stepped forward then, kneeling beside the boy who'd dropped his gun. "Run," she whispered. "And if you ever touch a fire you didn't light, I'll know." He scrambled away into the desert. Now it was only Briggs. He fired once, missed wide. Fired again. The bullet grazed Fallon's shoulder, but the gunslinger didn't flinch. Clara watched it unfold like a dream, like a story her grandfather once told about saints with guns and devils who wore silver. Fallon moved in a circle, slow, methodical, each step narrowing the distance. Briggs kept shooting, screaming now, eyes wild, until all 6 chambers clicked dry. Fallon stopped 10 feet away. Briggs panted, sweat pouring down his face. "You can't kill me," he spat. "I'm needed. I run everything from here to Dry Rock. You kill me, you start a war." Fallon tilted his head. "That's not my war." He holstered his revolver, and then tossed Briggs a knife, the same one Clara had driven into the earth. Briggs caught it, hands trembling. "What is this?" "Justice," Fallon said. Briggs lunged. He never made it halfway. Clara stepped between them, and swung the rusted shovel she'd pulled from behind her mule, the one her husband had once used to plant her daughter's tree. It cracked against Briggs' temple with a sound like fate finding its voice. He fell without a word. Dust rose. Fallon stared at her, expression unreadable. Clara dropped the shovel. "I didn't want to kill him," she said, her voice shaking. "I just wanted to be the one who stopped him." Fallon looked down at Briggs' motionless body. "You did." He stepped past her, knelt, and removed the silver spectacles from Briggs' face. Snapped them in half. Tossed the pieces into the wind. By sundown, the bodies had been buried. The canyon was silent. No more drunken laughter. No more fire. Just the sound of dust settling. Fallon mounted his horse. Clara stood beside him, arms folded. "You going to disappear again?" she asked. He nodded once. "Storms passed. Time to ride." She looked up at him, tired but alive. "You ever get tired of riding?" "Every day." "Then maybe one day you'll stop." He didn't answer. He just looked at her one last time, like she was something too strong to name, and rode into the dying light. The news traveled faster than the wind. By dawn, every porch in Merrill Creek was crowded, every pair of eyes searching the horizon for proof of what whispers claimed. Brig was gone. His men scattered or buried. The canyon that had echoed with their cruelty lay silent as a churchyard. Folks who had kept their heads down for years now stood upright, blinking into the sun as though seeing it new for the first time. Clara walked back into town with dust on her skirts and the faint tremor of victory still in her bones. She was tired, so tired she thought her legs might collapse beneath her, but she did not walk with her head bowed anymore. Behind her, the boy who had dropped his rifle at Fallon's mercy stumbled along, pale and trembling, muttering about ghosts and wolves that wear men's faces. No one stopped him. They only watched Clara, watched the widow who had stood against the devils that burned her home. At the well, she stopped. The townsfolk gathered around, cautious, expectant. Miriam Potts clutched her apron, lips tight but eyes wide. Saul Greeley leaned against the saloon post, jaw slack, a cigar gone cold at his hand. Even the preacher, who hadn't spoken a word louder than a prayer in months, pushed forward through the crowd. "Is it true?" he asked softly. "Is Brig?" Clara nodded once. The hush that followed was heavier than any sermon. A few men muttered disbelief, but the truth was in her stance, in the faint smear of blood on the rusted shovel she still carried. The powerless had risen, and for once, the cruel had fallen. Then the questions turned. Who was he? They whispered. The man who rode with her. The one who did the killing. Clara lifted her eyes to the horizon. Fallon was gone, of course, but his absence was louder than presence. She thought of his scarred face, his eyes that weighed every soul, the way he spoke of balance like a priest speaks of eternity. The preacher's hand trembled as he crossed himself. "Some say he was Marshal Fallon Kane," he murmured, voice brittle. "Shot dead at Red Hollow, 15 years past. Killed 6 men in that standoff before a bullet took him clean through the chest." Head snapped toward him. Marshal Kane, the butcher of Bitter Creek. "They called him Butcher," the preacher said, "because he cut rot out at the root. He was the law where law didn't exist, until the law itself turned on him." Whispers thickened like smoke. Men who had been boys during those years nodded, remembering tales their fathers had told. Women clutched their children closer, as though the legend itself might ride into their homes. Clara said nothing, but she remembered the bullet left on her land, the tin of beans, the blanket folded neat. Not gifts of kindness, tokens of justice, a lawman's creed in the shape of simple things. She closed her hand around the bullet in her pocket and held it tight, as if it might anchor her to something larger than grief. Life in Merrill Creek did not change overnight, but something unseen shifted. Doors that had closed now opened, at least a crack. Children played in the street again, laughter rising where fear had lived. Men who had once bowed to Briggs' riders now walked straighter, touched their hats to Clara when she passed. Not because she was rich or powerful, but because she had stood in the dust and not yielded. She rebuilt her home with help she hadn't asked for but could no longer refuse. The blacksmith offered iron nails without charge. Miriam Potts brought flour, though she did it stiffly, as if unwilling to admit guilt. Even Saul hammered boards into her new porch, muttering about how no woman should face wolves alone. The land was scarred, but life grew best in scarred places. Clara planted beans again, pressed seeds into the soil with fingers that no longer trembled. When the first shoots broke through, she wept not from sorrow but from a strange, aching gratitude. At night, she still prayed beneath the stars. Not for strength anymore. Not even for her lost husband or boy. She prayed for the rider whose name the earth itself seemed to remember. She prayed for Fallon Kane, whether he was living, half-dead, or something the frontier itself had raised to balance its scales. Sometimes, when the wind shifted, she thought she heard him. Hoofbeats far off, never near. A silhouette on a ridge at twilight, gone before she could blink. A rifle glinting once in the distance, like the sun tipping its hat. She never sought him out. Some legends aren't meant to be caught. The preacher said it best one Sunday, when the church bell rang for the first time in years. Men carve names into stone, he said, but the frontier carves them into dust. Fallon Kane was supposed to be dead. Yet he lives where justice is needed. Perhaps that is the way of it. Perhaps the West itself keeps him. And so the story grew. In saloons 2 towns over, they whispered about the gunslinger who walked from death to keep balance. In ranch houses lit by lanterns, they told children that justice might wear dust and scars, but it always rides. His face changed with each telling, older, younger, taller, thinner. But his eyes were always the same, heavy, unyielding, seeing what others refused to see. As for Clara, her life never became easy. The land still demanded sweat. Drought still threatened. Winter still bit deep. But she was not broken anymore. She worked her fields, her back straight, her heart steadied by the knowledge that when evil had come to her door, she had not stayed silent. She had risen, and she had found, in the shadow of a wandering gunslinger, that even the smallest flame could burn back the dark. Years later, travelers would still stop in Merrill Creek and ask about the widow who stood against Briggs' gang. They'd point to the house rebuilt on blackened soil, the beans climbing high, the cross on the hill that hadn't fallen since. Some said Fallon Kane had married her, others said he never returned. The truth was simpler and harder. She had carried on alone, but not lonely, because his shadow never quite left her. And in the end, that shadow became more than one man. It became a lesson whispered on every road and trail where dust hangs heavy. Justice does not roar. It does not beg. It does not wait for law or permission. It comes quiet, patient, inevitable, like hoofbeats on hard earth, steady and sure, carrying the weight of balance across a land too wild to tame. They say Fallon Kane died once, maybe twice. But each time, he rose again where he was needed most. Not as a killer, not as a lawman, but as the shadow that reminded the cruel the frontier still had teeth. And so his name was etched not on gravestones, but in legend. A name carried in whispers, in firelight stories, in the hush that follows gunfire. Fallon Kane. And those who listen closely, on nights when the desert wind is still, swear they can hear him riding, justice on quiet hooves, fading into the horizon, where wrongs wait to be set right.